welcome you all here. I'm so happy you've joined. I'm so happy you care about our country and about our democracy and about getting to be in a country where our elections are not so vulnerable to people coming in and interfering with the vote count. And I've been involved with election integrity since 2003, and I met Eva Waskell here at a meeting of the League of Women Voters, which I think is an amazing organization. And I was so impressed by what she said because it was echoing my experiences in the election integrity field. I'm just delighted to present to you here. I'm so glad I heard your talk at the League of Women Voters, and I'm so amazed at your history for so many years, since even the 1980s. And I just love the way you present it. So without further ado.
So tonight I would like to talk to you about the context and the environment of elections in the United States. I'm just going to cover the tip of the iceberg. This is elections at a glance. But I started with transparency because without transparency, we can't possibly define the problem and go about solving it. It's an essential first step. The goals of my short presentation are threefold. I want to just give you a general sense of how vast and complex elections, administration, and election reform is. Then I want to pique your curiosity so that you seek to know more. And then third, I want to encourage you to become involved in a way that's meaningful to you at where you are now. What do we mean by transparency? Something that's transparent is clear, easily understood, it's open, and the opposite of transparency, or a transparent system, is something that's opaque, it's secret, dishonest, complex, confusing. Everyone here, in principle, would agree that transparency is a good thing, right? Transparency is good. We want transparency in elections. But what happens in practice? That's the key. How is our principle of transparency translated into action? The handout that you have is an excerpt from a thesis by Joseph Lorenzo Hall, a PhD candidate from Berkeley, who's now at Princeton. And in the fall of 2008, his PhD thesis was entitled Policy Mechanisms for Increasing Transparency in Electronic Voting. And he has an excellent overview there, sort of a streamlined definition of the 4 pillars that support transparency. And the first one is access, the most basic element of transparency. Access means that voters should be able to get access to basic information about their electoral system, their voting system, and the procedures used to conduct elections. I would also add the people who are conducting elections. Another pillar of transparency is oversight, public oversight and scrutiny. The important point here is that oversight of a process you don't understand is meaningless. It's like me overseeing brain surgery or evaluating somebody's golf swing. If I don't understand the process, oversight is meaningless. The third aspect is accountability and responsibility, obviously. And then the fourth aspect of transparency is comprehensible. Understandable. Do we understand what's going on? Another important point to remember is that transparency and trust are flip sides of the same coin. If we want to trust our elections, they have to be transparent. We need to know what's going on. So transparency is absolutely essential if we're going to trust the election process in general and the election results in particular. And it's the loser in an election who really needs to trust the process, right? Because election fraud never, ever happens to the winner, right? Election fraud only happens to the loser. Some of the critical aspects of elections are the election industry, the companies, the private companies who manufacture the voting equipment. Not only do they manufacture the voting equipment, but they provide a full line of products and services, from all of the precinct supplies, the ballots, the voting equipment, the vote counting software, the ballot management software, the election management system, the absentee ballot processing. They do training, maintenance. So the vendors, the industry that I'm talking about, does end-to-end election services. And they operate in an environment, in a free market, unfettered environment, laissez-faire, that would be the envy of Wall Street. The voting system industry doesn't have any watchdogs. There is no government agency that looks at what they are doing, or their subcontractors, like the companies in the Philippines that make the touch screens. And let me be clear about what I mean by a watchdog. A watchdog is someone that has subpoena power. They can do criminal prosecutions. They have robust enforcement and the resources to do that. They can do surprise inspections, like the United States Department of Agriculture, can go into a slaughterhouse. A bank examiner can go in and examine a bank unannounced. And a watchdog would have some sort of reporting requirements for the deep ownership of these companies. What counts as regulatory environment now for the vendors is basically bad publicity and a letter of reprimand. The other thing about the free market environment here is that there's no government agency that does background checks on these employees, so including the programmers. Also, there was a Computer Security Act passed in 1987 that covers sensitive information whose loss, misuse, or unauthorized access to or modification of would adversely affect the national interest or the conduct of federal programs. But Congress, in its wisdom, exempted from the Computer Security Act of 1987 computerized voting systems. So, missed opportunity, because the Computer Security Act requires basic standards. It gets NIST involved in being sure that your programs meet some minimum security standards. So here was a missed opportunity in 1987 for our computerized voting systems to fall under the Computer Security Act. Let's give a T grade. That's a transparency grade, and the grade is up to you. For the industry, is there regulation? Yes or no?
No.
No.
Are there watchdogs or dog? No. Are the products of the industry covered by the 1987 Computer Security Act? No. Are there mandatory background checks for employees and people who work for the companies?
No.
So, from A to F, what's their T grade? F minus? F minus? Okay. Next, let's look at the testing and certification system, right? These voting systems have to be tested and certified before they're put into use. Up until January of this year, when the Election Assistance Commission certified 1 or 2 voting systems through the National Institutes of Technology, and they did it right, what I'm going to talk about now covers all the other voting systems that, of course, were grandfathered in. So what I'm going to talk about has been improved since January of this year, but basically the voting systems and the whole certification process has been run by people who aren't accountable to the public. The testing is done in private laboratories. The test protocols are a secret. The test results are published, but they're proprietary. No one could see them. As of January now, for these 1 or 2 voting systems, the test results are put on the web. But everything else out there, the test results are proprietary. There's been one person with unknown qualifications who has certified the majority of the systems, and we know that systems have been certified with flaws. The certification process does not include a line-by-line testing of the computer code, and the vendors pay the test labs, which is a conflict of interest. But as of right now, as we speak, a testing fund has not been set up for the vendors so that they pool their money and the National Institute of Standards and Technologies is paid. We're hoping that happens. So, testing and certification. Are there private labs, yes or no?
Yes.
Are the test methods secret?
Yes. Yes.
Qualified testers?
No.
Well, that's a question mark. We don't know. It's secret. He must know something, but that's okay. Question mark to know. Yeah, one person, Sean Southworth. Are the test results secret?
Yes.
Do the vendors pay the labs as of right now, today?
Yes.
Yes, they do. We hope it will change. So, what's a transparency grade for the testing and certification process? Class? F? Do I hear a minus?
Plus.
F plus.
If they got one, maybe.
All right. Now let's look at the contract. This is the contract that the counties sign when they purchase a voting system. What the contracts do is concentrate control in the hands of, are we surprised, in the hands of the vendors. I'd like to read just one paragraph from a contract. Again, this is Joseph Hall's PhD thesis about transparency. And Chapter 3 did a wonderful thing. They collected the contracts from a number of counties and analyzed them to see what the terms are. So this is one of the terms of the contracts. The customer shall not cause or permit any copying, reproduction, or printing of any output generated by the ES&S software. So that means that your election results, the interim reports, any output generated by their system is proprietary. Plus the information, if there's any publicity or if the election official wants to talk about their system, what it does or can't do, you have to talk to the vendor first. That's something that they want to control. In addition, the contract states that the election management system, not just the vote counting system, but the election management system that does the ballot layout, tracks the ballots and other things like that, is a trade secret. It also requires that the only people who can service that voting system are the vendors. The vendors do tech support on election night. Sometimes they're at the election computer. The roving technicians out in the field many times work for the vendor, or they've been trained by the vendors. So basically what the contract does is legalize the private secret counting of vote totals. It makes it legal. Unfortunately, privatization is not compatible with transparency. Is the vendor in control?
Yes.
Absolutely. The service, maintenance, tech support, the information about the system, is that controlled by the vendor?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And the vendors come down hard on any election official who violates that. So is the election management software, the vote counting and all of that, a trade secret?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that privatization?
Yes.
Yes, it is, with a capital Y. I should make this look like a Y, not an X. So what's the transparency grade for the contract?
F minus.
F minus again? Oh, my. All right. Now let's look at the election software. This is election software that's proprietary, and it's uncertified, and it's unregulated. We usually talk about the vote counting software, But the voter registration software, all the voter registration databases and the matching formulas that decide, you're a voter, you're not, you're on the rolls, you're not, all of that is proprietary and uncertified. The electronic poll books, when you go in to vote and you go to the poll worker and you say, my name is Mary Smith, I should be on your voter rolls, and they check, electronically. There's software that does that. It has to talk to the central database at the county. The software that runs the e-poll books belongs to the vendor. The absentee ballot processing, the absentee ballot tracking, and the signature verification that's done for absentee ballots, all of that software, and also the ballot layout software. Very, very complex. The software that decides how your ballot is going to look belongs to the vendor. So what's the transparency grade for the election software? F minus. Did I hear correctly?
F minus.
Yes.
Okay. People's choice. Election day is a logistics nightmare. You have thousands of people, thousands, maybe millions of pieces of equipment that have to be in one place at a certain time for 12 hours. San Francisco, for example, has 550,000 voters, about over 600 poll sites, over 3,000 poll workers. Transparency at the polling place. Well, this is where the armies of lawyers and the election protection efforts and the press, this is where you can find them at the polling place, looking for voter intimidation, voter suppression, voter fraud. All eyes are on the polling place. There's also an internal hotline in the county where calls come in from the field about machines that malfunctioned or supplies that are missing. That internal hotline that will give you a good measure of just what's going on right and wrong with the election, that's off limit. There's really no oversight for the hotline. And the roving technicians who are out on election day when a machine malfunctions are typically vendor trained, or they may even work for the vendor. The ballot chain of custody is something where transparency and oversight is lacking. I'm talking about the time from when the ballots, assuming you have optical scan paper ballots, that are brought in from the precincts, dropped off at the county courthouse or wherever the election department is, then they have to be processed. They have to go up to the central counting room to be processed, and then they go to storage. That's the whole chain of custody that I am talking about. Very little oversight, very little transparency. I mean, how many have you ever seen that process with your eyes for the first hand? Probably not. It goes on behind closed doors. And the posting of precinct totals, very, very important. So what's the transparency grade for election day? Remember, we've got
D minus.
D? Okay, let's give that a D. Election night is a totally different story. Let's be very clear about what happens on election night. This is when the keys of the kingdom are passed from one candidate to another. This is where our government becomes legitimate or not at this point. Voter registration systems and anyone working on voter registration efforts is vitally important. However, if we had Mother Teresa, the Pope, the Dalai Lama, and Nelson Mandela and their trusted circle of friends in charge of the voter registration system from end to end, the voting computer has the last word. Okay? Like the yin and the yang, you need both. You need a voter registration that is of the utmost integrity, and you need that same process in the counting of the votes. So what about the software on election night? Well, we know that's a trade secret, and it's impossible to view it or to know what's going on. The computer room has no meaningful oversight. Election observers are usually denied access. And the other critical point about the computer room is that there is no permanent, publicly inspected, complete record of what happens in that room when we are handing the keys of the kingdom from one candidate to another. It is a black hole. The computer operator is frequently the vendor. We had a heads up about this in 1975 from a report from Roy Saltman at the National Institutes of Standards, and well, it was called the National Bureau of Standards then. So we can't say we didn't know. On page 6, so if you were scanning this 131-page document, if you got to page 6, you would read, a situation in which a conflict of interest is a serious concern may be prevented if a vendor of election system components does not assume any responsibility for vote tallying. And then if you moved on to page 77, you would read, the Elections Administration must assume responsibility for all vote tallying activities. If it does not or cannot, because it does not have the expertise to do so, it is not fully carrying out its assigned governmental duties. The vendor, on the other hand, ought not to assume any responsibility for vote tallying. To do so would be to assume a governmental function which the vendor is not entitled to assume. Unfortunately, that's standard operating procedure. This 1975 report was unfortunately largely ignored. Election data, timely access to election data. We were talking about the raw data that comes out on election night, you know, the CUME reports and the precinct totals. You need to get this raw data to the public for a public election. You need to get that on election night. So what's the transparency grade for election night?
F.
You think an F?
Minus.
Well, I would say
F minus?
We have 4 points here. We had 5 points and all the F minuses. So.
Okay, so we'll leave this one at an F?
Half minus.
Okay, all right. How's that? F little minus. The California county that I'm very, very proud of is the Humboldt County Transparency Project, where after the November, as part of the November 2008 election, the Registrar of Voters, in partnership with some citizens, put all of the ballots, again, they had paper ballots, online after the election results were certified. So all of the ballots were put online, and privacy concerns are taken care of. So when election officials say, oh, we can't put the ballots online because, you know, voter privacy, that can be taken care of. There are ways to make that a non-issue. And the Humboldt Transparency Project then used open source software. Anyone could take the ballots and do a recount of their own. What they discovered is 197 ballots, absentee ballots were missing. So the election results weren't changed, but that's not the point. The point is that by putting the raw data, the original voted ballots, online for people to recount, they got a more accurate count than the private vote counting system that went through, you know, this certification process that we talked about. And it was a Diebold, now Premier Election Systems, it was a Diebold system. Fortunately, our California Secretary of State has endorsed the Humboldt Transparency Project, and I think that's a project that needs to be piloted in more counties, and that is really a model that needs to be duplicated and replicated in as many places as possible. A few quick words about election laws dealing with transparency. There's been a lot of state legislation, not much federal legislation except for HAVA, which was basically a stimulus act for the vendors. But the state legislation that's been passed since November 2000, that fiasco, really hasn't addressed transparency at all. It's dealt primarily with the voting technologies. Again, that's a visible problem, so it's easy to spot. And it's dealt with the issues that have historically been important to the political parties. So transparency, unfortunately, hasn't been addressed in many of those election laws. And some of the features of state election laws are that they don't cover what really matters. They're frequently vague and ambiguous. blogs of election law attorneys are filled with dialogue about how to fix these vague and ambiguous election laws. And what that means is that the local election official is then empowered to interpret that law. So if the rules aren't spelled out ahead of time, as they are, say, in the Minnesota recount, then you have the election official who has enormous power to decide then, almost on a case-by-case basis, what the rules are going to be. Lack of enforcement of the election laws is another big issue. There's also a gap between what the election law says and how it's implemented. For example, a lot of election laws say the vote counting is a public process, it's open to public viewing. Well, when the vote counting is electrons on a circuit board, you can't have a public viewing. You can't have oversight. The election laws also say that all election procedures can be observed. Well, as we saw, you can't get to the hotlines. The absentee ballot processing, goes on behind the curtains. We don't know what's happening there. So there's this huge gap that has to be filled. And in the courtroom, getting access to voted ballots is problematic because you run up to a catch-22. The judge, you come in, you believe there's fraud or there's a discrepancy between the official vote totals and the precinct records. Is it error or is it fraud? It's one or the other. And the judge will say, well, if you want access to the ballots, who've been in the sole custody of the election officials, you have to show fraud. But if you want to show fraud, you need access to the ballots. And that is a stalemate that the Humboldt Transparency Project can get around, because the voted ballots would then be put online. So our election laws have a lot of room for improvement. Now some good news. The organization that I talked about that gets it is an organization that from its very, very beginning has a long history in firmly believing and supporting open government. An open government is transparent government, is government with sunlight and watchdogs, and that's the League of Women Voters. One of your handouts was a transparency resolution, transparency in election procedures, that was passed by the California League of Women Voters. It was the Monterey League of Women Voters that created this transparency resolution and was instrumental in getting the state to pass it, and hopefully the National League will pass it. And it calls for transparency in all procedures in order to allow meaningful verification of ballot handling, tabulation, auditing, and other election-related records. So it's well worth reading, because transparency is the first step to understanding your voting system, and the way you understand your voting system is to get data about it. So you have data-driven policy as opposed to policy that is driven, as it is now, by experience and basically intuition. So I want to talk for just a moment about data and public elections and a few features of our election administration system. Our system is very highly decentralized. There are about over 3,000 jurisdictions that are basically fiefdoms, ranging from maybe 25 precincts to 3,000 precincts. The election officials are very dedicated. They work hard. They're underpaid. They're sorely lacking resources. They have no real oversight, no meaningful oversight. They're running on a shoestring budget. And there is no perfectly run election. As you start to look at election procedures, democracy is messy when you get down in the trenches. It is a sausage factory. It's not a chocolate factory. But a way to improve is to look at the messiness, the sloppiness that is going on behind the scenes, not to hide it, to face it, and then to work together to make improvements. as opposed to painting a very romantic or Norman Rockwell picture of elections and say everything is fine, when in fact it really isn't. This problem of not having data about election administration was talked about by a law professor at Yale named Heather Gerken. She does work for the Obama campaign, and she talks about a democracy index, or a way of getting information and data on our election systems to grade them. How can we grade election performance? Well, we can get data and get the election jurisdictions to compete against each other, kind of to embarrass them into doing better. But one of my favorite quotes from that book is where Professor Gerken says, "The dearth of data makes it difficult to be confident in any claims about our election system. We should be deeply troubled by our inability to know whether the election system is working or not." And she's right. We should be troubled about what we don't know. Look at all that we didn't know about credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations that were very complex financial instruments. So simplicity is very, very important. And that's where the resolution, the transparency resolution of the League is so important. Because the wisdom behind it is this. It's asking the question, would people act differently if they knew they were being watched? That's the bottom line. That will change everything. Even if you're making the sausage factory that is democracy, if we have eyes and sunlight on it to see what's happening, as sloppy as it is, then we can work together to fix it. So we have to get smart about what we don't know. And one of the things that I suggested to the San Francisco League of Women Voters is that they create a transparency index for their county, that they do a top-to-bottom review. You know how our Secretary of State, Deborah Bowen, did a top-to-bottom review of the voting systems? Now, they didn't look at chain of custody, or a lot of other issues, but they did a top-to-bottom review of the voting equipment, and creating a transparency index to look at the voting procedures in your county is certainly something very, very worthwhile. Concluding remarks. One reason election reform is such an intractable problem is that we want the quick fix. We want it done yesterday. We're addicted to speed. We've got to be the first in election, in election results. Everything has got to be done fast, convenient. We need to look at the big picture, and we also need to be aware of unintended consequences, like some of the things in the Holtz bill. So what I encourage you to do, first of all, is to educate yourself and do your homework. There's a website countedascast.com, which is a website that I send people to for an introduction. It's very well organized. Before we start to criticize, we need to understand what it is that's happening. The black box voting site, up in their left-hand corner, they have a citizens toolkit. It's what the San Francisco League of Women Voters used when they monitored some elections in San Francisco. And when the League asked the San Francisco Registrar of Voters to look at the ballots, the Registrar of Voters says, sorry, California election law says the voted ballots, unless there's a contest or an election challenge, are sealed, and they have to remain sealed until 22 months after an election, and then they're destroyed. So the election laws in California are a barrier to transparency. But the black box voting Citizens Toolkit is a great place to start. Scan the table of contents, and if there's a topic that jumps out to you, just go with it. And there's also a media kit. And look at the media kit because it focuses a lot on what questions to ask. The press is just totally asleep at the switch, has missed the fundamental dysfunctionality of what's going on in our election system. They're focusing on what you can see and what you can take a picture of. That's the voting systems, the long lines. Yes, those are problems, but there's a deeper, unseen, invisible issue of transparency, accountability that the press is totally missing. And the blackboxvoting.org Citizens Toolkit and Media Kit will get you to the right place in knowing what questions to ask. Second is to volunteer. The Election Defense Alliance at electiondefensealliance.org needs volunteers for citizen exit polls. Think of them as open source exit polls, because the exit polls that are done by the networks are proprietary, their methodology, they don't share their data, it's all a secret, there's an anomaly, oops, they can't explain it, you can't see our raw data. When citizens do exit polls, like the Election Defense Alliance, think of it as open source exit polls. And the other organization to support is the League of Women Voters. There is a chapter here in Marin. They have county chapters all over the state, and they get it. They get that transparency is the first and most important step to ensuring we have democratic elections and elections that we can trust. And then above all, vote. Vote and stay engaged. Also realize that the widely entrenched political tradition of election fraud goes back to the days of George Washington and the time of Pericles in ancient Athens. Computer fraud in elections goes back to 1964. So these vast and complex problems that I've just talked about are 45 years in the making. That's 16,425 days of extraordinary neglect in terms of resources, regulation, basic research in election science, oversight, accountability, and above all, transparency. So it's going to take patience and courage and a spirit of collaboration to bring about the necessary changes. And these are changes that we at the grassroots must demand if we're going to create transparent elections that we can truly trust. Thank you.